Look at a picture of Machu Picchu, and you'll probably think it looks like a peaceful mountain vacation. But the reality? Living there was a total survival nightmare. Today, we have grocery stores and painkillers. Back then, you paid your taxes with sweat and treated a simple headache with a rock drill. We're talking about farmers who were forced to freeze dry potatoes by stomping on them with their bare feet in the freezing cold. We're talking about doctors who cut holes in your skull without any anesthesia. To make it even worse, the government controlled literally every minute of your day. They told you exactly what to work on, what to eat, and where you were allowed to live. I'm just a guy who likes reading history stories, so subscribe if you want to stay for the ride. Also, where are you listening from tonight? Let me know in the comments. Let's get into the Inca Empire. So, first things first, you've got to forget everything you know about how a country is supposed to look. Usually, when we talk about big empires, we're talking about flat plains, wide river valleys, or maybe some rolling hills, places where it's easy to build a road and even easier to grow some food. But the Inca didn't play by those rules. They decided to build their entire civilization on the side of a wall. I'm talking about the Andes Mountains. This isn't just a little range of hills. This is the longest mountain range in the world. The Inca Empire stretched from what we now call Colombia down through Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, all the way into the middle of Chile. If you laid that out across the United States, it would reach from New York City all the way to Las Vegas. But instead of a flat highway, imagine that entire distance is nothing but jagged peaks and deep canyons. Now, let's talk about your first day there. You step out of your time machine, or whatever got you there, and you try to take a breath. Immediately, you've got a problem. Most of this empire sat miles above sea level. We aren't talking about a nice mountain hike. We're talking about 11,000 or 12,000 feet in the air. At that height, the air is thin, really thin. If you aren't used to it, your body starts to panic. Your lungs are screaming for oxygen that just isn't there. Your heart starts racing, trying to pump what little oxygen you have to your brain. You'll probably get a headache that feels like someone is driving a nail into your temple. You'll feel dizzy. You might even throw up. And that's just from standing still. You haven't even tried to do any work yet. The Inca people, though, they were built differently. Over thousands of years, their bodies actually changed to handle this. They had bigger lungs and more red blood cells than the average person. They were basically natural-born marathon runners. You, on the other hand, would be gasping for air just trying to tie your shoes. Once you get over the breathing part, if you even can, you look around and realize there is nowhere to walk. Seriously, there is almost no flat ground. If you want to go anywhere, you're going up or you're going down. The Inca lived in a vertical world. Their front yard might be 1,000 feet higher than their backyard. Think about what that means for a second. There are no horses here. There are no oxen. There aren't even any wheels. Even if the Inca had invented the wheel, it wouldn't have done them any good. You can't pull a cart up a 70-degree slope. You can't push a wagon over a narrow mountain pass that's barely wide enough for a person to stand on. Everything that needed to be moved had to be carried by humans, or maybe a llama, if you were lucky. And llamas aren't exactly big. They can't carry a person. They can only carry about 60 or 80 pounds. So if you're building a stone house on a cliffside, guess who is hauling those stones? You are. You're lugging heavy rocks up a staircase made of dirt and jagged stone while you can barely breathe. And speaking of stairs, that was their version of a highway. To get anything to grow, they couldn't just plow a field. They had to carve the mountainside into giant steps called terraces. They basically turned the mountains into massive green staircases. They moved millions of tons of earth by hand just to create a few feet of flat dirt to plant some potatoes. This is the baseline for life in the Inca Empire. Before you even worry about the laws, the taxes, or the neighbors, you have to fight the earth itself. You are living on a giant vertical spine of rock. The weather can change from a blistering sun that burns your skin to a freezing snowstorm in a matter of minutes. One wrong step on a narrow path and you're gone. No second chances. So when you think about the Inca, don't just think about gold or fancy stone walls. Think about the sheer physical grit it took just to exist. You had to be tough as nails just to walk to the neighbor's house. Most of us today get winded walking up a flight of stairs at the mall. In the Inca Empire, that flight of stairs was your entire life, and it never, ever ended. So you're standing there on those stone stairs, lungs burning, and you realize something. You aren't just out for a physical challenge. You're on the clock. But here's the kicker. You aren't getting paid. Not in coins, anyway. If you reached into your pocket right now to find $1 or a piece of silver, you'd come up empty. The Inca didn't use money. They didn't have shops. You couldn't just walk down to a corner store and buy a snack, because the store didn't exist. There was no such thing as a business owner or a private company. Everything, and I mean everything, belonged to one guy, the Sapa Inca. He owned the hills. He owned the valleys. He owned every single blade of grass. He even owned the llamas. If you were wearing a shirt, the emperor owned the wool it was made from. You were just borrowing it so you could do your job. This is where the mita comes in. Since there was no money to pay taxes, you paid the government with your body. Think about how much you hate tax season today. Now imagine if tax season lasted for several months every single year, and instead of filling out forms, you had to go build a highway through the mountains by hand. That was the mita. It was a mandatory labor tax. Every able-bodied man had to do it. One month, the government might tell you to go work in the mines. The next month, they might send you 300 miles away to build a stone fortress. You didn't get to negotiate your salary. You didn't get to ask for a raise. You did the work because that was the law. And the law was enforced by people who didn't take "I'm tired" for an answer. The state ran your life like a giant, complex machine. They knew exactly how many people lived in your village. They knew how many potatoes you grew. They even knew how many pairs of sandals you went through. They kept track of all this using these knotted strings called quipus. It was like a prehistoric spreadsheet. And that spreadsheet decided your fate. If the records said they needed 50 guys from your town to go pave a road, you were going to go pave that road. You might think, fine, I'll just quit, but you couldn't. The land was divided into 3 parts. One part was for the gods, one part for the emperor, and one part for the people to feed themselves. You didn't get to choose which seeds to plant or when to harvest. The government officials told you exactly what to do and when to do it. You didn't own the dirt you were digging in. You were just the person holding the shovel. If you tried to run away, where would you go? The mountains are a wall. The next town over is also run by the emperor. There was nowhere to hide. You were a piece of the system, and the system was everywhere. But there was a trade-off. It's the reason the whole thing didn't just fall apart. In exchange for your total freedom, The state made sure you didn't starve. They built these huge stone warehouses called kulkas all over the mountains. They were filled to the ceiling with dried meat, corn, and frozen potatoes. If there was a drought or a bad harvest, the emperor would open those doors and feed everyone. You were never going to get rich, but you were never going to go hungry as long as you did what you were told. It was a weird kind of security. You didn't have to worry about a career or a bank account. Your job was guaranteed for life. But you also never got a day off. You never got to decide to be an artist instead of a farmer. You never got to see what else was out there. Your entire existence was defined by work. You worked for your family, you worked for your village, and most of all, you worked for the man at the top. Every single day, from the moment you could walk until the day you died, your life belonged to the state. You were a tool, a very efficient, well-fed tool, but a tool nonetheless. So when you're standing on those stairs, gasping for air, just remember, you can't go home. You're already at work, and the shift isn't over for another 40 years. Let's get specific about that work. Imagine the government decides you're a bridge builder. You don't know the first thing about bridges, but it doesn't matter. They'll teach you how to twist giant cables out of grass. You'll spend your days hanging over a 1,000-foot drop, weaving a bridge that will probably be replaced in a year anyway. You do it because if you don't, you're a criminal. And in the Inca Empire, being a criminal usually meant you didn't stay alive for very long. Even your clothes were a signal of your status. You couldn't just decide to wear a fancy hat if you weren't supposed to. Everything was regulated. What you ate, what you wore, where you lived, it was all part of the plan. It's hard for us to even wrap our heads around that today. We spend our lives trying to be individuals. We want to stand out. In the Inca world, standing out was a great way to get yourself in trouble. You wanted to blend in. You wanted to be the perfect silent gear in that massive mountain machine. The scariest part isn't the work itself. It's the fact that you have no say in it. Today, if you hate your boss, you can quit. You can find a new job. In the Inca Empire, the emperor was your boss, your landlord, and your god. You didn't quit on God. You just kept climbing those stairs, carrying whatever heavy load the state put on your back until you couldn't climb anymore. You're already exhausted from that climb, but don't think for a second that you get to sit down. Those massive stone stairs weren't built for your morning cardio. They were built because the Inca lived on the side of a mountain and still had to find a way to feed 10 million people. In a place where most people would look at a cliff and see a dead end, the Inca saw a farm. They carved the mountains into giant green staircases called terraces. Think of it like a stadium where the players are corn stalks instead of athletes. These weren't just simple dirt mounds either. They were engineered. They had stone walls to hold in the heat and layers of gravel to make sure the rain didn't wash the whole thing away. If you were living there, your entire day was spent walking up and down these steps, carrying tools, seeds, and water. You're farming on a tilt. One wrong step and you aren't just tripping, you're falling 3 stories into a patch of beans. Now let's talk about what you're actually growing. You aren't getting wheat or rice, you're getting the potato. But forget those nice clean russets you see at the grocery store. The Inca had hundreds of different types. Some were purple, some were yellow, and some looked like lumpy rocks. They grew them because potatoes are tough. They can handle the thin air and the freezing cold that kills everything else. But just because they grow easily doesn't mean they're easy to eat. You don't just peel these and make fries. you have to turn them into something called chuño. This is the part where you'd probably quit. Making chuño is a long, gross, and painful process. First, you take your harvest and spread it out on the ground during the coldest part of the year. You leave them there all night so the frost can freeze them solid. Then the sun comes up and starts to thaw them out. This is where you come in. You don't get to wear boots. You have to walk onto that field of cold, wet, mushy potatoes with your bare feet. Your job is to stomp on them. You're jumping and shuffling over these freezing tubers to squeeze every last drop of water out of them. Imagine the feeling of cold mud and potato guts squishing between your toes while the Inca wind bites at your face. It's not a quick job. You do this for days. Freeze them at night, stomp them during the day. You're basically a human juice press. Why do all that work? Because once you squeeze the water out and let them dry in the sun, those potatoes turn into little gray balls of starch that stay good for years. They won't rot, they won't mold. You can toss them in a dark room and eat them a decade later. It tastes like eating a piece of chalky cardboard, but when the snow hits and the fresh crops die, that cardboard is the only thing keeping you alive. If you're lucky, you might get a little bit of meat to go with your potato chalk, but don't go looking for cows or pigs. The Inca didn't have them. Instead, look under your feet. See those little furry things running around the floor of your house? Those are guinea pigs. In your world, they're a cute first pet for a 7-year-old. In the Inca Empire, they were lunch. They lived right in the kitchen, eating the scraps you dropped on the floor. They were basically living trash cans that you eventually put on a stick and roasted over a fire. There's no petting them or giving them names. If you get attached to the one with the white spot on its ear, you're just going to be sad when Friday night dinner rolls around. Every single meal you eat in this empire is a result of pure physical struggle. There are no stores, there is no trading for something easier. You either build the wall, plant the seed, stomp the potato, or you starve. You're constantly fighting the altitude and the incline. Every calorie you put into your body was earned by burning twice as many calories just to get it. By the time you finally sit down to eat your bowl of gray potato soup and your roasted rodent, you're probably too tired to even chew. And the worst part? You have to wake up tomorrow and do it all over again, because the sun is coming up, the frost is melting, and those potatoes aren't going to stomp themselves. Your back hurts, your feet are numb, and your boss is a god who doesn't take excuses. Welcome to breakfast. So, you've finished your breakfast of frozen, dried potatoes. Your stomach is mostly full, but your day is just getting started. You look out at the horizon and see the mountains. They aren't just scenery here. They're the walls of your world. And if you want to get anywhere, you have to climb them. But you won't be doing it on a nice paved highway with a car. You won't even have a horse. In the Inca Empire, the wheel didn't exist. Well, they knew what a circle was, but they didn't use wheels for transportation. Why? Because a wagon is useless on a staircase, and this entire empire is basically one giant staircase. They didn't have horses, cows, or oxen either. The only pack animal they had was the llama. Now, llamas are great, but they are also incredibly petty. If you try to put more than 80 pounds on a llama's back, or if you try to sit on it yourself, the llama will just lie down, look you in the eye, and spit a green glob of half-digested grass into your face. They don't do riders. So if something needs to get from point A to point B, you are the one carrying it. To make this work, the Inca built one of the craziest road systems in history. It's called the Capac Nan. We're talking about 25,000 miles of road, carved right into the sides of the Andes Mountains. That's long enough to wrap around the entire Earth. These roads weren't just dirt paths either. They were paved with flat stones and lined with walls. Since the mountains are so steep, the roads often turned into sets of stairs that go up for miles. Imagine doing the Stairmaster at your gym for 10 hours straight, but the air is so thin you feel like you're breathing through a cocktail straw. That is travel in the Inca Empire. Now, you might think a system like this would be slow. It wasn't. They had a mail system that would put a modern post office to shame. They used these guys called chasquis. These were the elite marathon runners of the ancient world. They didn't run the whole way themselves. They ran in a relay. One chasqui would wait at a little stone hut called a tambo. He'd hear a conch shell blowing in the distance, which was the signal that the next runner was coming. He'd jump up, start sprinting, and the two runners would jog side by side for a few seconds, just long enough to pass off a message or a bundle of goods. These guys were so fast, they could move a message 150 miles in a single day. To give you an idea of how wild that is, the emperor back in the capital city of Cusco could order fresh fish from the Pacific Ocean. The runners would carry that fish over 200 miles and up 11,000 feet in elevation, so fast that it was still fresh when it hit the emperor's plate. You're stuck eating your stomped potatoes while he's having high-altitude sushi, all thanks to a bunch of teenagers sprinting up mountains in sandals. But eventually, even a paved road hits a dead end. The Andes are full of massive canyons with whitewater rivers at the bottom. You can't build a stone bridge across a 500-foot gap when you don't have steel beams. So the Inca used grass. I'm not joking. They took a specific kind of tough mountain grass, braided it into small ropes, and then braided those into massive cables as thick as a man's torso. They would stretch these cables across the canyon and tie them to huge stone anchors on both sides. Walking across one of these is a nightmare. It's a suspension bridge made of plants. It sways in the wind. It bounces with every step you take. You can see straight through the floor to the river hundreds of feet below. If you're afraid of heights, this is where your journey ends. They had to rebuild these bridges every single year because grass eventually rots. You just have to hope you aren't the guy crossing on the day the floor decides to give up. Here is the kicker, though. Even though these roads and bridges were amazing, you weren't allowed to use them. If you were a common farmer, the road was off limits. You couldn't just decide to go on a road trip to see the ocean. The Kapaknan was for the military, the messengers, and the government. There were checkpoints everywhere. If a guard caught you wandering the road without a permit or a specific job to do, you were in big trouble. The roads were the veins of the empire, and the emperor kept a very tight grip on who was moving through them. You lived your life in your village, looking out at the road, knowing that if you stepped foot on it without permission, it might be the last thing you ever did. So, you're stuck in your village. You're looking at that road, and you're probably thinking, I should just make a run for it. I could find a new life somewhere else. But here's the thing. Even if you did manage to sneak onto the road without a pass, where would you go? Every single person you'd meet along the way is living under the exact same set of rules as you. And those rules, they weren't just some suggestions written in a book somewhere. They were a code. 3 simple phrases basically decided if you lived or died. Think about it like this. Most of us grew up with hundreds of laws. We have big books full of things we can and can't do. The Inca kept it way simpler. They had three big ones: Amasua, Amalulia, Amakela. In plain English, that means don't steal, don't lie, and don't be lazy. It sounds easy enough, right? Most of us try to follow those anyway. But in the Inca world, if you slipped up even once, that was usually the end of the line for you. There weren't any lawyers to call. There were no judges who'd let you off with a warning because it was your first offense. They didn't even have jails. Think about that for a second. No prison cells, no orange jumpsuits, no doing time. Why would they waste the food and the space keeping a criminal alive? If you broke the law, you were either a productive member of society or you were dead. It was that simple. They didn't want to rehabilitate you. They wanted to get rid of the problem. Let's say you got caught stealing. Maybe you were hungry. Maybe you just wanted a nice piece of cloth your neighbor had. The punishment wasn't a night in a cell or a fine. They'd take you to the edge of a jagged cliff. They'd make you look down at the rocks way at the bottom, and then they'd just push. That was it. No second chances. If you were lucky, you'd die on impact. If they wanted to make more of an example out of you, they'd use stones. They'd gather the whole village, line everyone up, and you'd stay there until the job was done. It was about keeping the machine running. They wanted everyone to see exactly what happened when you put yourself above the group. It was a very loud, very clear message. Play by the rules or get crushed. But the one rule that would probably get you, the one that would definitely get me, was the rule against being lazy. In our world, if you don't feel like working, you stay in bed. Maybe you lose your job, but you don't lose your life. In the Inca Empire, being lazy was literally a crime against the state. You see, the whole empire ran on something called the mita. It was basically a labor tax. You didn't pay the government with money or gold. You paid with your sweat. You spent a few months every year building bridges, carving massive stones for temples, or working in the king's fields. Everyone had a job to do. If you were healthy and you weren't working, you were basically stealing from everyone else. You were taking food from the communal storehouses without putting anything back in. To the Inca, that made you a parasite, and they didn't have much patience for parasites. They had inspectors who would walk through the villages just to check in on people. They weren't looking to make friends. They were looking for dirt. They'd look at your hands to see if they were calloused. They'd look at your tools to see if they were being used. If your house was messy or your clothes were falling apart because you didn't feel like weaving, that was a red flag. If they decided you were being lazy, you were in big trouble. It wasn't just about you being tired, it was about the system. If you didn't do your part, a bridge didn't get built. If a bridge didn't get built, the army couldn't move. If the army couldn't move, the empire was weak. So by sleeping in, you were basically committing treason. Imagine the stress of that. You wake up every single morning knowing that if you don't give it 100%, you might literally get thrown off a mountain. There was no such thing as a weekend. There were no holidays where you just sat around and did nothing. Even their festivals involved heavy lifting and constant movement. You were always on, always performing. It was a machine, and you were just one tiny gear. If that gear stopped turning, the people in charge would just pull it out and throw it away. You'd be replaced by someone else who was more willing to work. You lived every second of your life with a knot in your stomach, wondering if today was the day you'd accidentally look a little too tired in front of the wrong person. So you're standing there, trying your best not to look exhausted, because you know what happens to people who can't keep up. But let's say your luck finally runs out. Maybe you're working on one of those massive stone temples and a rope snaps. Or maybe you're a soldier and a guy from a rival tribe swings a heavy star-shaped club right at your face. You wake up on the ground with the worst headache of your life. Your skull is cracked and your brain is starting to swell. In our world, you'd be in an ICU with a dozen machines keeping you alive. In the Inca Empire, you're about to meet a man with a very sharp rock. This is where things get truly terrifying. The Inca were actually incredible surgeons, but their version of surgery is something out of a nightmare. They practiced something called trepanation. That's a fancy way of saying they're going to cut a hole in your head to let the pressure out. And no, they don't have a hospital. You're likely lying on a dirt floor or a flat stone. There are no bright lights or white coats, just a guy kneeling over you with a leather pouch full of tools. He reaches into that pouch and pulls out a knife made of obsidian. Now, obsidian is just volcanic glass, but don't let that fool you. It can be honed down to an edge that's thinner and sharper than the steel scalpels surgeons use today. It's incredibly precise, but it's still just a piece of broken glass, and he's about to use it to saw through your forehead. Now, you're probably wondering about the pain. We have anesthesia today. We have pills that knock you out so you don't feel a thing. The Inca didn't have any of that. They had two things, coca leaves and chicha. They'd have you chew on a big wad of those leaves until your mouth and cheeks felt a little numb. It's the plant they use to make cocaine, but chewing the raw leaf just gives you a bit of a buzz and a dulling sensation. Then they'd hand you a jug of chicha, which is a thick fermented corn beer. They want you drunk. They want you so drunk you can barely sit up. But here's the catch. You aren't going to sleep. You are wide awake for the entire thing. The doctor starts by slicing your scalp open. You feel the cold air hit your skull. Then comes the sound. This is the part that would break most people. He takes that obsidian blade and starts to grind. He's not always cutting a clean line. Sometimes he's scraping. Imagine the sound of a shovel hitting a dry sidewalk, but that sound is echoing inside your own ears. He's pushing down bit by bit, moving the blade in a circle or a square, digging through the layers of bone. You can hear your own skull being turned into powder. You've got a couple of guys holding your shoulders and your legs because your body's natural instinct is to fight. Every nerve in your head is screaming. The chicha helps a little, but it doesn't stop the feeling of a rock being forced through your skull. You can feel the vibration of the scraping deep in your teeth. As the hole gets deeper, the blood starts to pool. There aren't any fancy suction machines here. The doctor is just wiping it away with a piece of cotton or a rag. He might even spit a little chicha into the wound. They didn't know about bacteria, but they knew that strong alcohol kept the rot away. Finally, you hear a wet popping sound as the piece of bone is pried out. Suddenly, that intense throbbing pressure in your brain eases up. If you had blood trapped under your skull, it drains out now. You're staring up at the sky through a haze of pain and beer, and you can literally see your own pulse thumping in the hole they just made. Once the pressure is gone, the doctor doesn't just leave you with a gaping window in your head. He might take a small piece of hammered gold, or maybe a piece of a seashell, and fit it over the hole like a manhole cover. Then he pulls your scalp back over it and stitches you up with some plant fibers. Now, here's the truly crazy part. Most people actually survived this. We've found hundreds of skulls with these holes in them, and a huge amount of them show that the bones started to heal and grow back around the edges. That means the patient lived for years after having a hole carved into their face with a rock. By the time the empire was at its peak, their survival rate for this surgery was about 80%. That's better than what soldiers were getting during the American Civil War hundreds of years later. But just because you survived doesn't mean you're going on a vacation. There was no recovery time in the Inca Empire. Once you could stand up and walk without falling over, you were expected to get back to it. You'd be back in the fields or back in the line of fire with a piece of gold in your skull and a memory of that scraping sound that would probably keep you awake for the rest of your life. In our world, we complain if the waiting room at the doctor's office is too cold, or if the needle for a flu shot pricks a little too much. In the Inca world, if your head hurt, a guy would carve a hole in your face while you were drunk on corn beer, and then he'd tell you to get back to work. You wouldn't last a day, because we've forgotten what it's like to have to be that tough just to see tomorrow. But being tough was only half the battle. Surviving the cold and the back-breaking work was one thing, but not getting yourself executed for a social mistake was another challenge entirely. That is because at the very top of the food chain sat a man who wasn't just a king or a president. He was the Sapa Inca. To the people living in the mountains, this guy wasn't even human. He was a living god, the son of the sun itself. And if you think your boss at work has an ego, you haven't seen anything yet. Dealing with the Sapa Inca was like trying to handle live electricity with your bare hands. One wrong move, and you were finished. Imagine for a second that you actually got an invite to see him. Maybe you're a local leader, or you've done something so important that you have to report to the capital. You don't just walk into a room and say hello. The rules for being near him were designed to make you feel as small as possible. First, you had to take off your shoes. It didn't matter if the ground was freezing or rocky. You went in barefoot, because the ground he stood on was considered holy. But that was the easy part. Before you could even get close, you had to find a heavy load, like a big sack of supplies or a massive stone, and strap it to your back. You had to walk into the room hunched over, literally crushed under the weight of this pack. This wasn't because the king needed you to move furniture. It was a physical way of saying that you were a beast of burden and he was a master. You were showing him that you were a servant and that his very presence was a weight you were honored to carry. Once you were in the room, the rules got even weirder. You were forbidden from looking him in the eye. In fact, most people never even saw his face. He usually sat behind a large screen or a piece of fine cloth. You had to keep your head down and look at the floor. If you even dared to peek at him, it was seen as a massive act of disrespect. You weren't worthy of seeing his face, and he was too holy for your eyes to even touch him. You had to sit there, barefoot, with a heavy rock on your back, staring at the dirt, and wait for him to acknowledge you. It was a total power trip, but it worked. It reminded everyone that there was a massive gap between the ruler and the regular people. You weren't just in a different social class, you were a different species. Everything the Sapa Inca touched became sacred property. This created a massive logistical nightmare for the people who worked for him. Take his clothes, for example. He had a small army of women who spent every waking hour weaving the most beautiful tunics and capes you can imagine. They used the softest wool from baby alpacas, dyed with the most expensive colors. It took months of hard work to make just one outfit. The Sapa Inca would put that outfit on in the morning, wear it for a few hours, and then take it off at the end of the day. And he never wore it again. He wouldn't give it to a friend, he wouldn't donate it to the poor, and he wouldn't sell it. Instead, his servants gathered up everything he wore that day and put it in a special chest. Once a year, they had a huge ceremony where they took all those thousands of hand-woven clothes and burned them. To them, the clothes were now part of his divine essence. They were too hot for any normal human to touch or wear, so they just turned them into ash. It was a massive waste of resources, but it sent a clear message. The king had so much power and so much wealth that he could literally burn the most expensive things in the empire every single day, just because he could. It wasn't just his clothes either. It was everything. Anything he touched, any food he didn't finish, and even his own body waste had to be collected and cared for. They actually saved his hair clippings and his fingernails in special jars. But the weirdest part, and the part that would probably make you want to quit on your first day, involves what happened when he just sat around. If the Sapa Inca was sitting there and a single strand of hair fell off his head and landed on his shoulder, a servant had to act fast. That servant would pick up the hair, and then they had to eat it. Yes, you heard that right. They had to swallow the king's hair. The reason for this was pure paranoia and religion mixed together. They were terrified that a sorcerer or an enemy might get a hold of the king's hair and use it to cast a dark spell on him. In their minds, if you had a piece of someone, you had power over them. So the only way to make sure the hair was safe was to put it inside a loyal servant's stomach where no one could ever find it. It shows you how much they feared for his safety and how much they valued every single cell of his body. To be a servant to the Sapa Inca meant you had to be ready to eat his hair just to keep him safe from magic. When he traveled, he didn't walk on the ground like a normal person. He sat in a fancy chair called a litter that was carried on the shoulders of several strong men. These weren't just random guys either. They were specialized carriers who had to walk in perfect rhythm so the king didn't feel a single bump. If one of them tripped or stumbled, it was a huge scandal. There were even people who walked in front of the chair with brooms, sweeping the road so that not a single pebble or piece of trash would be in his path. They were literally cleaning the earth before his shadow even touched it. You wouldn't last a day in this world because we just aren't built for that kind of submission. We live in a world where we can tweet at leaders and complain about the government. In the Inca Empire, you couldn't even look at the leader. You were nothing more than a tool used to keep his world running. The gap between you and him wasn't just about money. It was about the fact that he was a god, and you were just the guy lucky enough to eat his hair so he wouldn't get a curse put on him. It was a world of total control, where one man's daily life was more important than the lives of millions of his subjects combined. And that total control didn't just stop when the heart stopped beating. That's the thing about the Inca that would probably break your brain the fastest. In our world, death is the end. You leave your house to your kids, you get a nice headstone, and you're gone. But in the Inca Empire, the king never really checked out. He just transitioned into a new phase of his career as a living mummy. If you were a regular person living in the capital city of Cusco, you'd see this every day. When a Sapa Inca, that's what they called the king, finally died, they didn't bury him. They preserved him. They used special herbs and the dry mountain air to keep his skin and features looking as real as possible. They dressed him in his finest clothes, decked him out in heavy gold jewelry, and sat him in a chair. But here is the crazy part. He kept all his stuff. In any other culture, the new king gets the old king's palace and his money. Not here. Thanks to a rule we call split inheritance, the dead guy stayed the owner of everything he'd earned while he was breathing. His palace, still his. His servants, still his gold mines and his farms, all still belonged to the mummy. Think about the logistics of that for a second. You have a city filled with these massive, beautiful palaces, but the living king can't live in any of them. They're all occupied by dead guys. Each mummy had a whole team of people who were basically his staff for the afterlife. They'd clean the palace, maintain the gardens, and manage the money. If you worked on one of those farms, you weren't working for the government. You were working for a corpse. You were literally a tenant for a man who had been dead for 50 years. And it wasn't like these mummies were just hidden away in some basement. They were part of the party. When there was a big festival or a wedding, the servants would pick up the mummies on golden litters and carry them into the main square. They'd set them up in a circle so they could visit each other. You would see a line of mummies sitting there, and people would come up to them to pay their respects. They'd offer them food, real food, like roasted guinea pig and corn. The servants would hold the plates up to the mummy's mouth, wait a bit, and then burn the food. They believed the mummy was eating the smoke, or the spirit of the meal. They'd even pour corn beer into a bowl in front of the mummy. If the bowl stayed full, it meant the king wasn't thirsty. If it spilled or evaporated, they figured he was enjoying his drink. But they weren't just there for the snacks. These mummies were political powerhouses. If the current king wanted to make a big decision, like starting a war or changing a law, he went to talk to his ancestors. Of course, the mummies couldn't talk back, so they had special priests who acted as their mouthpieces. They would interpret what the mummy wanted. Usually, the mummy wanted whatever was best for his own family and his own land. This meant the dead guys were basically a shadow government. They had a vote. They had influence. They could stop the living king from doing what he wanted. Imagine trying to run a country when your dead dad still has a say in your budget. Now imagine being the new king. You just got the crown, which is great. You're the son of the sun god. But you have a huge problem. You're technically the most powerful man on earth, but you're essentially broke. You don't have a palace because your dad is still living in it. You don't have any farmland to pay your soldiers because your grandfather still owns all the best valleys. You don't even have your own gold because your ancestors are literally wearing all of it. This created a massive, desperate need for war. If you wanted to have anything of your own, you had to go out and take it from someone else. You had to conquer new tribes, grab new land, and build your own wealth from scratch. You couldn't just sit back and enjoy being king. You were on a clock. You had to get enough land and gold to support yourself now, and enough to support your own mummy and your own staff after you died. This is why the Inca Empire grew so fast. It wasn't just about ego, it was about real estate. The empire had to keep growing because the dead were taking up all the room in the old neighborhoods. Every time a king died, a huge chunk of the empire's economy was basically taken off the table and handed to a ghost. The living were constantly running out of resources because the dead wouldn't let go of theirs. As a regular person, this would have made your life a nightmare. You'd be living in a world where the past was more important than the present. You might be a farmer who has to give half his crop to a king who died before you were even born. Or worse, you're a young man who gets drafted into the army. You're sent hundreds of miles away into the freezing mountains or the humid jungle to fight people you've never met. And why? Not to protect your home, not to feed your family. You're fighting because the current king needs to find a new valley so he can eventually have a place to sit when he's a mummy. It was a cycle that couldn't last. The more the empire expanded, the harder it was to manage. The lines of communication got longer, the enemies got tougher, and the internal pressure kept building. You had a bunch of powerful families who were all protecting the interests of different dead kings. They'd argue over who had more power and whose mummy deserved more respect. It was like a game of politics where half the players were corpses. If you tried to live there, you'd realize pretty quickly that you didn't matter. The system wasn't designed for you. It wasn't even really designed for the living king. It was designed to keep the dead alive forever. Every day you spent working, every battle you fought, and every tax you paid was just fuel for a palace full of mummies who were never going to leave. So you have this empire that's basically a giant machine built to keep dead kings happy. But sometimes feeding the mummies and keeping the ghosts comfortable wasn't enough. In the Inca world, if things went wrong, they went wrong in a big way. We're talking about massive earthquakes that leveled cities, or droughts that lasted for years until the corn stopped growing and the llamas started dying. When that happened, the Inca didn't look at the weather, they looked at the gods. They figured the sun, the moon, and the mountains were angry about something, and they needed a way to fix it. This is where things get really heavy. This is where we talk about Capacocha. If you lived in a village far away from the capital, you'd eventually see the king's officials show up. They weren't there for your crops this time. They were looking for children. They wanted the most beautiful, healthy, and perfect kids they could find. We're talking about boys and girls who didn't have a single scar or a blemish on their skin. To the Inca, these kids were the best thing the human race had to offer. Now you might think the parents would be screaming or trying to hide their kids in the woods. And sure, some probably were terrified. But the way the Inca set this up, it was supposed to be the biggest honor your family could ever get. If your child was picked, your social status went through the roof. You weren't just a farmer anymore. You were the parent of a future god. The Inca believed these children weren't actually dying. They were becoming messengers. They were going to live forever in the spirit world, sitting right next to the gods, making sure the rain kept falling for the rest of the people back home. Once the kids were chosen, their lives changed overnight. They didn't go back to playing in the dirt or helping with the harvest. For their whole lives, these kids had probably lived on potatoes and water. Now, suddenly, they were eating the finest corn and dried llama meat. They were given the best clothes made of the softest wool. They were treated like royalty because in the eyes of the state, they already were. Then the long walk started. These kids were led on a journey that could cover hundreds of miles. They had to walk all the way to the capital city of Cusco. Imagine being a 6-year-old child walking through the massive stone gates of the heart of the empire. You'd see the emperor himself, the Sapa Inca. He'd host giant feasts in your honor. People would line the streets just to see you pass by. There was music, dancing, and gold everywhere. It was a giant celebration, but everyone knew how it was going to end. After the party in Cusco was over, the real work began. The priests led the children out of the city and toward the highest peaks of the Andes. We are talking about mountains that are 20,000 feet high. Even today, people who try to climb these peaks have to use high-tech gear and oxygen tanks just to stay conscious. The air up there is so thin it feels like you're breathing through a straw. It's freezing, the wind never stops, and the ground is nothing but jagged rock and ice. But the Inca didn't have parkas or oxygen tanks. They just had wool blankets and a lot of faith. They'd march these kids up the slopes, higher and higher, until they reached the very top. To keep the kids from panicking or getting too tired to walk, the priests gave them chicha. That's a really strong beer made from corn. They also had them chew on coca leaves, which is what we get cocaine from today. It kept their hearts racing and helped them deal with the altitude sickness. By the time they reached the summit, the kids were usually in a daze. They were drunk, high, and exhausted. When they finally hit the top, the priests had two ways of finishing the ritual. Sometimes they'd build a small stone chamber or a pit. They'd put the child inside, wrapped in beautiful blankets and surrounded by gold statues and tiny llama figures. Because it was so cold and the kids were so tired from the climb and the beer, they'd just fall asleep. They'd sit there in the dark, and within an hour or two, they'd freeze to death. They never woke up. In other cases, if the priests were in a hurry or the ritual demanded it, they'd use a heavy club to hit the child once on the back of the head. It was quick and it was over. After the child was dead, the priests would bury them right there on the peak. They'd leave them with food, shoes, and clothes for their journey into the afterlife. Then the priests would walk back down the mountain and tell the village that the sacrifice was accepted. The deal was done, the gods were happy, and the rain would come back. It's easy to look at this and think these people were monsters, but you have to remember how they saw the world. They didn't do this because they liked hurting people. They did it because they were scared. They lived in a world where a bad harvest meant every single person in the village would starve to death. They thought that if they didn't give the gods their best, the gods would take everything from everyone. They were willing to trade one life to save 10,000. That's the reality of the Inca Empire. It wasn't just about building cool walls or growing a lot of potatoes. It was a world where your life, and even your children's lives, belonged to the community. You were just one small part of a much bigger machine. And if that machine needed a soul to keep the gears turning, it didn't matter who you were or how much you were loved. You did what you were told, because the alternative, the gods turning their backs on you, was way worse than death. This is why you wouldn't last a day. You'd have to accept that your life wasn't yours to keep. It was just a payment waiting to be collected. And that payment I mentioned, it came due a lot sooner than anyone expected. You see, the Inca didn't just have to worry about guys with swords. They were hit by a killer they couldn't even see. Years before the Spanish actually showed up, their germs were already making their way down from the north. I am talking about smallpox. It was a nightmare. People were dying in droves, and nobody knew why. It wasn't like a bad flu. It was a skin-crawling, body-shutting-down kind of death that wiped out entire villages before they even knew what was happening. In 1527, this invisible killer did something that changed everything. It killed the emperor, Huayna Capac. And then it killed his chosen heir. Imagine if your entire government just vanished in a week without any plan for who takes over. That's the chaos you'd be waking up to. Suddenly, the empire didn't have a head. This sparked a massive, bloody civil war between two brothers, Atahualpa and Huascar. They both thought they should be the next god king. You'd be stuck in the middle of this family feud. This wasn't some quiet political debate. It was 5 years of neighbors killing neighbors. Armies marched back and forth across the mountains, burning crops and trashing the very system that kept everyone alive. By the time Atahualpa finally won, the empire was exhausted. It was broken. It was like a giant who had just finished a marathon and was now bleeding out from a dozen different wounds. That's exactly when a guy named Francisco Pizarro showed up on the coast with only 168 men. Now, if the Inca were at their peak, they would have wiped Pizarro off the map in 20 minutes, but they weren't. Pizarro and his crew were looking for one thing: gold. They didn't care about the culture or the people. They brought things the Inca had never seen. They had horses, which looked like giant monsters to people who had never seen anything bigger than a llama. They had steel armor that made them look like metal men. Your wooden clubs and stone-tipped spears just bounced right off them. Atahualpa, feeling pretty confident after winning his civil war, agreed to meet Pizarro in a town called Cajamarca. He brought thousands of his best people with him, but here's the thing: they weren't really ready for a fight. It was more like a celebration. They thought these 168 strangers were just a weird little curiosity they could deal with later. When the emperor arrived in the town square on his golden chair, a Spanish priest walked up and handed him a Bible. Now think about this. Atahualpa had never seen a book before. He didn't know what it was. He held it to his ear to see if it spoke to him, and when it stayed silent, he got bored and threw it on the ground. That was the moment everything changed. The Spanish used that as a signal. They came out of the buildings where they'd been hiding and just started shooting. The Inca had never heard a gun before. It sounded like the gods were screaming. The smoke, the thunder, and the horses charging into the crowd created pure terror. Pizarro's men cut through the guards and grabbed Atahualpa. They didn't want to kill him yet. They wanted him as a prize. They dragged him away while his people were massacred in the square. Atahualpa was smart, though. He realized these men were obsessed with gold. He looked at the room where he was being held. It was about 22 feet long and 17 feet wide, and he made an offer. He told Pizarro that if they let him go, he'd fill that room with gold as high as he could reach, and then he said he'd fill it twice more with silver. Pizarro took the deal. For months, you would have seen the wealth of an entire civilization being stripped away. Gold came in from every corner of the empire. Beautiful statues of gods, plates from the Sun Temple, and intricate jewelry were all brought to that room. But the Spanish didn't care about the art. They just wanted the metal. They melted all of it down into boring bars of gold. It was the biggest ransom in the history of the world. But Pizarro never had any intention of playing fair. Once the rooms were full, the Spanish got worried. They were deep in enemy territory, and they knew that if Atahualpa stayed alive, his people might eventually try to rescue him. So they put him on a fake trial for crimes he didn't commit, and they executed him. Just like that, the system broke. You wouldn't have survived because the leader who kept the world turning was gone. Without the Sapa Inca, the empire was a body without a brain. The roads stopped being safe. The food stopped moving. The diseases kept spreading. You wouldn't have lasted a day because your world didn't just change. It literally ended. The combination of germs and steel didn't just beat the Inca, it erased them. But even when you erase an empire, the ghost of it sticks around. You can't just delete 100 years of massive construction projects and millions of people overnight. The Spanish took the gold and they broke the government, but they couldn't break the mountains. If you go to Peru today, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see stone walls that were built so well that you can't even fit a knife blade between the rocks. These walls have stood through 500 years of massive earth. But even when you erase an empire, the ghost of it sticks around. You can't just delete 100 years of massive construction projects and millions of people overnight. The Spanish took the gold and they broke the government, but they couldn't break the mountains. If you go to Peru today, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see stone walls that were built so well that you can't even fit a knife blade between the rocks. These walls have stood through 500 years of massive earthquakes. When the big shakes hit, the modern Spanish buildings fall down, but the Inca stones just dance in place and settle right back down when it's over. They built things to last forever, and in a lot of ways they did. Think about the roads. The Inca didn't have the wheel, but they built 25,000 miles of paved highway. They cut stairs into cliffs and swung bridges across canyons that would make a modern engineer sweat. Those roads are still there. People still walk them. And then there are the terraces, those giant green steps you see on the sides of mountains. The Inca built those to turn vertical rock into farmland. They were so good at it that they could grow enough food to feed 10 million people in a place where most people today would struggle to grow a single tomato. Farmers are still using those same terraces today, 5 centuries later, because the Inca system was just that efficient. Then there's the language. The Spanish tried to force everyone to speak their way, but it didn't fully stick. Today, there are still millions of people across South America who speak Quechua. That's the original language of the empire. When you hear it spoken in a market in the Andes, you're hearing the same sounds that the Inca kings used to give their orders. The empire died, but the culture was too strong to stay buried. So here is the big picture. When we look back at the Inca, we see a world that was basically a giant, perfectly tuned machine. It was probably the most organized society that has ever existed. Nobody was homeless. Nobody went hungry. If your crops failed, the government opened up a giant warehouse and gave you enough food to last until the next season. If you were too old to work, the state took care of you. If you were sick, your neighbors were forced by law to farm your land for you. It sounds like a paradise, right? You get total security. You never have to worry about where your next meal is coming from or where you're going to sleep. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. To get that security, you had to give up every single piece of yourself. You didn't own your time. You didn't own your house. You didn't even own the clothes you were wearing. The government told you what to wear, where to live, and who you were going to marry. You couldn't just decide to move to the next valley over because you liked the view. You couldn't start a business or try to get rich. You did what you were told, when you were told, for your entire life. If the state decided they needed a bridge built 100 miles away, you were packed up and sent there to work until it was done. No questions asked. And then there was the price of keeping the world running. The Inca believed that the sun only rose and the rain only fell because they made the gods happy. And sometimes the gods wanted more than just a prayer or a sacrificed llama. If there was a huge drought or a volcanic eruption, the empire didn't just hope for the best. They took action. They would take the most perfect children from different villages, dress them in the finest clothes, and lead them to the tops of the highest mountains. They'd give them a strong drink to make them sleepy, and then leave them there in the snow to die. It wasn't about being mean. It was just a cold, hard trade. One life for the survival of the rest. To them, the group was everything, and the individual was nothing. So if you woke up tomorrow in the Inca Empire, you'd have a full belly, you'd have a roof over your head, you'd have a job and a community that wouldn't let you fall. You wouldn't have to worry about the future because the future was already planned out for you by someone else. But you would never be free. You would be a gear in a clock. You'd be safe, but you'd be stuck. I want you to really think about that. If someone came to you today and offered you a deal where you'd never be hungry or homeless again, but you had to give up every choice you have, would you take it? Would you trade your freedom for that kind of security? Because that was the Inca way. It was a world of total order and zero liberty. You wouldn't have lasted a day, not because you couldn't do the work, but because you wouldn't know how to live without being you. They had everything figured out, but they forgot to leave room for the person inside the machine. And in the end, maybe that's why it was so easy for the whole thing to come crashing down.